Hey everybody, it's Booksy, and today is December 28th. I'm doing an AMC review for Tuesday. So, what an interesting day. If you watched the video yesterday, you know that I was going into the day very bullish. We had a spring at the end of the day yesterday, and sure enough, this morning we started with a nice run to test basically some upper regions that I don't think they mean a whole lot. Except for that they help define perhaps the current range that we're in, so to speak. If you're looking at this in terms of a upward channel, we did test the upper region of the channel. We retested right around, I guess it was 2970, something like that, and not surprisingly it kind of kept us below this in this kind of like this previous pocket that we've been stuck in for a while. If we were to draw like a box here, we've been talking about this in terms of Wyckoff and some other things, but really we're looking at this whole region as one large cup, and we haven't really broken out of, I would say, if you were to draw across this region, you see how this was a touch point really early on. And then we got the high of this particular breakout, and we have not come back to that point in several days. So certainly going into today, looked like it was going to be a lot more bullish. And looking at this now and just looking at this cup pattern, maybe that was a little bit too gung-ho, so to speak. We were just kind of like, hey, this is a perfect setup, and it is, and in a lot of ways it still is. The setup hasn't really changed very much at all. The difference is that the speed at which it's happening is probably significantly slower. So you could have drawn your cup more or less like this, all right, this inner, and that would have been pretty valid up until today. And maybe even just a slightly wider version of it also would have been pretty valid up till today. The other option is to still have this sort of a wide basin, but just really like stretch it out. And you're kind of considering this as like more of a long-term, awkward looking basin, but yeah, so yes, this didn't work out like we thought it would. I'm going to talk a little bit about that S-curve that I did in the video, because I posted it on Twitter this morning, and oddly, and I think it is odd, and I'll get to that. Oddly, it did follow. But I think there's a couple things that went wrong there that I got wrong, and I want to just kind of briefly touch on that later. First, I just want to get into just sort of the bare bones of the stock today. If you're looking at this as a T3 pattern, which is sort of the way I've been thinking about it, like a breakout pattern, then the best place to look, or one of the best places to look, would be the macro T3, which was our January to May fractal, specifically the latter half of that, because the first half of that is just a bit of a mess. It's difficult to sort of interpret this region right here for obvious reasons. But from there on, it actually tracks really well. And a lot of our other fractals that are T3 triggers look a lot like this. So I did a map of it as best I could. You get that double tap repeating pattern that we saw, which tests the bottom of a basin. The first one does in this case, the second one does not. And so the push down afterwards does test the bottom of the basin. And I know you may be thinking that perhaps that means that we haven't actually seen the bottom, and that is a possibility. I'm not going to say that's not a possibility. It's a possibility where this is perhaps, and it's almost difficult to draw, right? Some kind of a really wide, doesn't look quite right, but yeah, maybe something like that. And then this would be the bottom over here, more or less in the center. That's one way to look at this, but I don't think that that's very consistent with some other things that we've seen, namely this region. This region doesn't make a whole lot of sense as this. There is a slight head and shoulder here, but it doesn't break down. There's nothing else in this region specifically that I found that strongly indicates that it's one-to-one. You do get this sort of double arch bottom, but it's not. It's a lot closer to this over here, or even this right here, than it is to this region. So I did go through, I found this particular pattern in the middle here, and so I'm pretty confident that this drop that we had at the end of the day and early morning today was this middle drop, so to speak, that appeared in this fractal. And then it was a really, really rapid push into the head and shoulder. You can see that the head and shoulder, just like it did back in April, it did break above the previous two push-ups here. So that's consistent. And then we got a big sell-off. And so that would be this large sell-off here. This was very much in line with what we've seen on these sell-offs, where you have sort of a stair step down. Okay. And then when you get to the bottom, you enter into another smaller head and shoulder. And basically at this point, you could have been looking at our own more recent fractal, because it was playing out essentially like one-to-one. I'm not going to pull it up right here because this is a fixed chart, but let's just hop over. You can see what I'm talking about. Yeah, so you have this pretty clear like patterning on this head and shoulder formation where you have this double top and then it kind of bleeds down. Get the double top and it bleeds down. And this looks like the head and shoulder, but this is this long section right here, although it looks really ominous. This actually tracks pretty well with what we were just talking about, which is these two little pops right in this region, and then a head and shoulder, which would be this right here. So even though this looks really scary, I do believe that more than likely this particular head and shoulder right here that pushes down is actually this head and shoulder that's actually pushing down. So it's informing what's actively going on right now. I did draw just like a simple line. I mean, sometimes that's the best way to do it. And there's a clear downtrend right here that we're just kind of whipsawing around throughout the day today. It was, I mean, I guess to me, looking at it now, it's like pretty obvious that that was the direction they just wanted it to go. So if you're looking at like a map of like where it was going to go today, this just tracked this downtrend. That's all that happened. And eventually it kind of hit right here, which is roughly this trend line from these two bottoms. So nothing is particularly overextended at this point. I know there's a lot of different ways to look at this stock. And certainly like if you look at in regards to just the basin, and that's what I've done here. Hang on a second. I did this on the 5-minute. Yeah. If you look at just the basin, all right, the touch points on the basin, then yes, like this right here was a breakdown of this particular circumference, whereas this is sort of the initial one. It hasn't broken out of that just yet. And I know this looks like some kind of weird summoning medallion, like witchcraft. It's that's exactly what it is. I'm trying to summon buyers. No, I'm actually messing around with what this is a fib resistance arc, and it's not. I don't really care that much about the resistance part of it. More so, I just wanted to get a really clean arc. So I fixed and locked my time frame so that I could get a really clean arc on this. And then I noticed that there was a few trend lines that when you pass through, like when you're pointing on a fixed time frame, they touch opposite markers, which is kind of interesting. Not perfectly, but it's pretty compelling actually. If you look at the region and when they get overextended, you know, they kind of come back to this sort of center line, which is right here. I'm not saying this really means a whole lot right now. I just believe that this was sort of what we were talking about earlier in terms of there's a couple of these lines, these support and resistance markers that probably are the ones that define our trading range the best, right? And you can kind of see that the stock is clearly favoring some of those more than others. But yeah, I just noticed the strangeness of that on this particular patterning. There's no mathematics really behind these lines. I just drew them. But anyways, let's get back to the meat of this. So let's talk about this particular day. And what do we think what can we learn from all this? And what is important and like what's not that important. I know I'm jumping all over the place. But yesterday everyone was talking about how this was a repeat. It repeated again. It was the same fractal. And it's just that this particular version of it was heavier on the selling. In fact, it was almost mirror opposite of this particular day. If you look at, I'll show you in a minute on like a 15 or 30 minute, this day and this day, all right, it looks like if you just switch all of the green to red, it's almost the same. So yeah, I mean, this is the same fractal sequence. You can see that there's a head and shoulder, right, breakdown. In this case, it happened much lower, but it's still there. And then you have this push up into what looks like a T1, but it could be a T1, T2. It doesn't really matter. The point is that you get this really clear, distinct plateau looking head and shoulder, okay, that occurs. And then we talked about this being like an inverse head and shoulder, and you do get that here, but it just didn't work, right? It goes up into as you can see, another head and shoulder. And so it's the same fractal at play that we saw the last couple of days. So it's iterated 3 times now. The same sequence, it just looks a little different. Let me show you the volume. And this is the main reason why it looks different. Let's go to 15, actually. All right, yeah, check this out. So if you look at this pattern, starting right here, okay, this is right where the day shifted. You see how it opens really red, and then this opens really green, and then it shifts to almost predominantly green as it runs up, and this shifts almost predominantly to red as it runs down. And then there's a little bit of relief here. You get a little bit of relief here, and then again, you know, we got a push down, but in this case, it's kind of being bought back, right? And then this one does much the opposite, and then we ended on a really nice green bar, right? And then today we ended on a really, really big red bar, almost the same size. So it's almost like it's the same fractal, but by mirroring, like by opposite, like switching the volume to being opposite, like a heavier. So if you were doing like 2 times buying one day, but then the next day you did 2 times selling, that's how you could manipulate a fractal to look different. Really interesting. But yeah, let's again get back to this fractal. This is kind of the most important thing today to look at. And then I'll talk about this S-curve last. I know that a lot of people didn't really care about that anyways, but I thought it was really interesting, and I think there's something to it. But yeah, so this particular fractal, okay, it is, I'm going to keep it up over here. It's typified by being this sort of spring fractal that we see when it does appear in other regions, all right? So here's the most recent example of where we saw this fractal. Now you'll notice that the push down here went well below this previous drop. So you might be thinking, well, does it have to go below this previous drop? Well, the short answer is no, it does not, because it could. I'm not saying it won't. Maybe in the morning we do see a final push down to just spook everybody. But the reason why I don't think it's as significant is because if you look at where we were trading at this time, right? This really wasn't significant at all. I mean, this was a rising, I guess it was sort of like a rising wedge at one point. But where we are now, we're talking about this as part of the arc. So it's already broken down beneath that. And aside from just like getting a nice deep spring out of this, which again, you might see that because typically our springs are like at least 2-step, you go down and then you get the weird looking head and shoulder and then it happens again, right? On the bottom, you get the same, you get this fractal right here, right? But it's really compressed. And that's what happened in this region, okay? Because remember, this is where we used to break out, which was the T3, but now it goes into a spring action every time. So you see this fractal, and then what normally follows is this very large move. Okay, it's happened here. I'll show you 2 more places where I know it's happened. And then we'll talk about that S-curve. It's also happened here. In this case, this one is less clear because reasons. But this is definitely a spring. If you remember, this is where it broke down out of the major pennant that everyone was tracking. And this acted as a spring action. I mean, it almost looks really obviously like a spring. It doesn't look as clearly like this one as the others do. But it has the same markers. You see this push up right here. Okay, so this is like your V shape, but it looks a little bit less like this V. It has the platform, but the V doesn't go very deep, and then it pushes up, and then you come down and you have a little bit of an M or a W, right? You get another push up, and then you get a sell off into a spring, all right, that then moves it back out of this particular trading range, right? Back to where it first fell, which is back here on this little cliff. In our case, you could argue that perhaps that just means that maybe it comes to like this region right around 28. But you know, it's hard to say. This is not exactly 1-to-1. And if you look at the next one, this one looks a little bit more like what we're seeing. Specifically, check out this region right here. Okay. I know it's a little bit hard to see, but this push up looks a lot like what we saw in the morning. So if you're looking at this in terms of you want to just sort of see each of the moves, well, you can see them, okay? They're here. So this push up would be right this region right here. Right, this was that push down that occurred right there. This particular arc maybe could be thought of as this. And then from there, it's not as 1-to-1, but I would say this push down is meant to sort of be like this one. And before you cry foul, remember this W looking thing. It is here, it's present here. It's not as pretty as it is down here, but this is, I mean, you can look at them. They're largely the same. So if we just examined this fractal and we were able to match it pretty much 1-to-1 with this fractal right here, then this is also the same fractal, right? Because these two are matching. So sometimes the form that they take is not as recognizable, but this did have that 1-2 push down, 1-2 push down, right? And into a, head and shoulder, all right, that form these sort of little horns here. Now in this case, this push, again, it brought them back out of the trading range, matched up to here. This was back in like $14. So it brought us back out of the trading range that we were in, and then it continued upward. So it's the same as the one that occurred here, albeit the one that occurred here was much slower. If I had to make an estimation and just say, here's my best guess in terms of which one is probably more likely, I would say this is the one that's more likely, that it might push up and then form another, like form a proper SOS or cup and handle, if you want to say that, at the top of this range, right? Or the bowl, wherever that may be. And then you get this iteration. So it wouldn't happen like this, we're just going to go straight up, but it would hesitate and do another pullback, which is fine. That's kind of the way we've been talking about it. And if you look at the patterning here, it would make some sense to have that, because it would act as a larger head and shoulder here, where perhaps you have our inverse head and shoulder, a smaller inverse head and shoulder than the much larger one. But again, it's just another possible signal, right, that could be used, something like that. Okay, and that would make sense to me, and it would probably happen right under $32, because that's been the main range that we've been trying to get over. That's the R1 trigger range. There's a plenty of T3s in here and other iterations in here that can be used as triggers or as signals for institutions to buy. All right, last thing, I'm just going to talk about this S-curve. So I'm not going to get into the mathematics again. I talked about yesterday, I think, how I drew this thing up, all right, why it looks the way that it looks. I use the Gann box because it's just a way of dividing time and price. And what I was trying to do, I'm going to unlock this. I'm just going to mess up my other thing, but it's okay. But what I was trying to do was do a predictive move, assuming that this was like a macro, like the macro move, right, into a T3. And it almost worked, right? It got all the way to this point, and it looked really good. If you were watching, well, I don't really know. I don't think I posted about it that much, but this arc is just really nice. And that orange line is the center line. That's a 618, and on the fib, I think it lined up with that roughly. And anytime it was above it, it acted as support. Anytime it was below it, that line acted as resistance. And sure enough, when the day started, it was very much the same, right? Like it found this as a resistance. It was almost tracking really well, I mean, on these arcs. When it broke out, it found it as support. And then it was trying to continue upward. And this is where, obviously you're looking at this and you're like, okay, now I can see it's clearly a head and shoulder. But then it just got shot down, and we had two major push downs, and I thought, well, that could have been a spring action. And I still think that's a possibility, that this is like another iteration. You see these horned head and shoulder looking things. All right. It's just the way that this looks. So I think at this point right here, this whole region, it just slowed down, and it started doing those micro iterations we've talked about. We've seen it like dozens of times at this point, where it's just kind of repeating the same thing over and over as it's moving down. And that's why this looks like just junk. And it stopped tracking, right? And I think if I had had one more curve, I probably would have had it on this touch point. And more than likely, my bet would be that this is where it would hit. You can just kind of see that. And then maybe through here, right? So does that mean that this was complete and total bust? Well, the answer is yes. I mean, it wasn't accurate, right? It did not pan out. It went with it for a little while. And if you remember, I drew this, I think the first thing I drew, at the time I drew this was probably a few days ago. And so I was looking at, maybe 2 days ago, I was looking at this region, and it was tracking pretty well. And that's when I decided to use the Gann to make it more accurate. But there's a couple key mistakes here. Number one, You never know where that middle is. And my hypothesis was just simply it had to be on that that liquidity test that happens around T2. But in this particular region, we're talking about this right here. This is not the same region that you would normally use this S curve. If I were to use it, I would be using it, on a region where you have a clear head and shoulder, right, into all the way up into an R. So you have a T test, right? You have head and shoulder right here. You have a T test. You got the R1, R2, R3. That's the region that you want to use it in. Now, that does exist here, but if you're looking at this within the context of the macro, this region is just not as clear. And even when you go through, you can find the sequence there, but it's ugly. So this was not the best region to try to use this on, and it wouldn't have made any sense, right? Like, if I could draw, I'll just do it really roughly here. If I can do it, I mean, maybe there's an argument that could be made that, and I think this is kind of what I landed on earlier, was that something around the lines of either this, where it's really low, right? Or this, where perhaps it's hitting higher. And maybe there's both, right? So should I throw it out the window and just never use it again? Well, no. I just think that I made a mistake with like where I was doing it, right? And if I had tracked it, it kind of makes me wonder if I had taken this point and put it down here, if it would have lined up at all. I don't think it would have. But it's interesting to think about. And I also wonder, if you see the way that this was drawn, if like perhaps the angle of this arc could have been more severe, right? And then again, landed on the top of the head and shoulder. And it's possible. I'm not going to redo it, not this time. But at this point, there's nothing that really lends itself to this particular region in terms of that S curve. So at this particular point in time, I'm not going to do it for this region. There may still be some validity to doing it on the larger region, which is this right here, right? And so there's still a case that could be made. Let me see if I have it on here. Yeah, for this kind of an arc to be drawn, right? But at this point in time, no, it's not really tracking very well, and I don't have a bearing for it either. So maybe something like that, where it's a little more extreme, and then this was like an early push out, right? Maybe time will tell, and we'll look back and say, yeah, that was it. But for now, just kind of let it rest and think about it more later. So anyways, going into tomorrow, I'm excited to see what happens. Even if we get a push down in the morning, I'm thinking that we're right in this particular moment where we're going to see another push up. And I don't think anything has really changed. And so we see like a major breakdown that's sustained into a close underneath this region. I'm not viewing it as distribution. It's all part of the same motion. We're still not way below where we were over here. I mean, there's no reason to panic at this point in time. So anyways, I hope you all enjoyed, and I'll talk to you later.